Hey, it's Ollie, and in this video I'd like to answer the question whether or not you should rely on translation when you reach higher levels in a language. Now, translation is one of those things like Marmite, you either love it or you hate it. But I've always found that translation is a very, very useful tool for language learning, especially at the beginning, because you can, when you first start learning a language, you can read a bunch of rules in the textbook. You can read about, this is how you form the present simple and the present continuous, and this is how you conjugate these verbs and all of that stuff. And that's cool, and that can be helpful. But also, you can learn a lot by translating. And this is something I always find myself doing in a new language. As I'm looking at a phrase in the target language, I'm thinking, right, well, how does this translate into English? If I were to say this in English, what would I say, and vice versa? And also, sometimes a literal translation could be informative as well. If you translate a phrase, and you literally do it word for word, so you're looking that shows you the word order in the target language, and that could be very different to English. So the English translation you end up with might not make any sense, but by the same token, that is also very informative because that lets you see, okay, well, that's how the grammar or the word order works in that language. So translation is a really, really useful thing. It's certainly, I think in the olden days, one of the original language learning methods was known as grammar translation, and that's where literally everything involved translation. So you would, and they still teach like this in a lot of countries actually. I remember when I was in Japan, I saw school teachers do just this. You'd have a long text or a long chapter of a story or something, and they would go through literally word for word and analysing what that means. Now, that can be helpful in moderation. The issue is really that when you start to get to a higher level, when you progress in the language, you start to have some competence in it. Maybe you can read it fairly comfortably. Maybe you can speak it. At this point, this is where I think translation really stops having much of a purpose for learning, for learning purposes, because every language has its own nuances, and some languages are very similar to others. But even very similar languages have differences as well. If you think about, for example, Spanish and Italian, in many ways it's very similar, but also has some very important differences. And so, as you get to a higher level in a language, the most important thing for me, I've found, is that to start transitioning away from using your mother tongue altogether, and to start to do everything that you can in the target language. And the reason is that it's by that exposure to the language that you start to learn. And if you can, one fantastic challenge for anybody is to read an entire book in the language you're learning, and that might not be possible until you are, at a decent level. But once you can do that, something very interesting starts to happen. You stop worrying about, does this make sense in English, and you start thinking about, well, how does this make sense by itself, in and of itself? And you start to look at the target language and you start to look for meaning, and then over time, what happens is you just get used to it and things become normal. So I remember very clearly reading my first book in Spanish. It was Love in the Time of Cholera, El Amor en el Tiempo de Cólera, by Garcia Marquez, and it was tough at the beginning, but I remember the first few pages I was like, man, I don't think I can do this. And but then by the end, it took me good, I think 5-6 weeks to get through it. But by the time I got to the end of the book, I had stopped translating in my head. I was simply reading it for what it was, and that was kind of a trigger point for me in many ways. And at that point, I started to just kind of say to myself, right, I'm just going to listen to Spanish for what it is now. I've proven to myself that I can read a book and enjoy it, not understand everything, and that's fine. But actually read a book and enjoy it. And so it's by getting that exposure to the language and accepting it for what it is, not trying to relate everything to English, that you really begin this process of finally getting used to the language, which is when then you can reach the really, really high levels. So yeah, in summary, translation can be a great tool, but the higher level you get in a language, you need to make sure that you move away from English and do everything you can in the target language. For things like reading books, like using monolingual dictionaries, stop using bilingual dictionaries, watching your favorite TV shows, reading your favorite books in the language. That's the way that you're really going to get used to the language and start to really own it. Hope that's helpful. See you in the next one.